Well, good evening, everybody. I am Christy Amberke, Executive Director of One Voice for Volusia. And joining me this evening is Laura Hawley, the Training and Education Director for Community Coalition Alliance. And we have Rhino Foster, Certified Peer Specialist, Narcan Committee Chairman, and Fathers Inspiring Recovery and Evolution Program Facilitator at Volusia Recovery Alliance. Shiloh Lebo, our Prevention Coalition Coordinator at One Voice for Volusia, is monitoring the chat and will be helping with questions. So just a few little housekeeping rules. Just if you are online, if you mind muting yourself, I know there's not too many of us, so that works to our advantage, but just to make sure that the presenters can hear and focus. And if you do have any questions or comments, please feel free to place them in the chat. There will be time at the end for questions and answers. So hang on to them or go ahead and add into the chat throughout the session. And if you would like to receive a follow-up email from us with resources and information, please drop your email address in the chat and we'll pull from that to send that email. And just a little bit of information for you. And as we share with you, we acknowledge that there are many different situations and experiences, and we want you to feel comfortable and respected in this group. We will be discussing substances and data around overdose fatalities, and we will be sharing insight and best practices for having conversations with our young people. We really hope this empowers you to apply this information to your situation and your beliefs. We do want to keep this session focused on learning. So if you don't mind, we're going to keep us on mute until the very end, and then that way we can learn as much as we can and then answer questions. So to get us started, Rhino, would you like to share with us?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for the introduction. Again, I'm Rhino Foster from Volusia Recovery Alliance, and I got some statistics here today. The National Institute of Drug Abuse does a national survey of students in high school from 9th to 12th grade, asking them about their substance use, and it's an anonymous thing, and it's an anonymous survey, so they can fill out these questions and these surveys without any type of pressure or, consequences going behind it. They can just kind of share freely what they've kind of been exposed to, or maybe substances that they might have experimented while being in high school. And if you're looking at the statistics, they're kind of, I don't know, for me, like when I was looking at them, it seems kind of like the norm from when I was in that age. But the landscape is quite different now. So when I'm looking at it at my age now, knowing what I know about fentanyl and the substances and the counterfeit pills, with 7 out of the 10 pills having a fatal dose of fentanyl in them, and over 90% of the illicit pharmaceuticals being counterfeit and containing some form of fentanyl. It's quite a different conversation that we're having today than we were having 25 years ago. I know just this past year, towards the end of last year, there was a couple of vapes at Deltona High School. There was a young man that was in the bathroom smoking a vape. That was a THC vape, and it contained fentanyl. And he had 4 of those vape cartridges on his persons. And then when they searched the home, there were several other cartridges at the home, and they all contained fentanyl. And that's something that's very scary. The vapes, how I see it is, it's kind of like the cigarettes were when we were kids. It's kind of like the cool thing that the kids are doing as a peer pressure thing, or trying to be accepted amongst their peers. And it's very common in the age. We're looking at, if you look at some of these stats, the 8th and 10th graders of alcohol use, it's around 15%, around 30%, which has pretty much stayed kind of consistent, except for the 12th graders. If you're looking at the 45%, it's reduced a little bit from 51, almost 52%. The vaping, while 11% of the 8th graders are showing that they've been vaping in the last year, the nicotine use dropped from the 20% to the 17.5% in 12th graders, I mean, in 10th graders. And it seems like the older that the kids are getting, the less amount of vaping that they're doing. So that's positive. And I know with the cannabis, it's saying 8% of the 8th graders and 17% of the 10th graders, 29% of the 12th graders report the cannabis use. And with this survey, this is the first year that they started doing the Delta 8 THC, which is a form of cannabis, but the molecule is slightly changed to make it legal to sell. So it's sold in these smoke shops. It's sold with as gummies, different flower smokable form, and the cartridges that they can use, the vape pens, which have which are way less detectable, because it's not like smoking a cigarette. It's the smell is a lot less. Kids can kind of do it in the bathroom or on the school bus, and it's less detectable. So it's popular among the kids. Which the Delta 8 is scary too. I was working at residential a couple of years ago, residential treatment facility, and I seen quite a bit of kids, late teens, early 20s, come in psychosis, and they'd be in psychosis for weeks using this Delta 8. I don't know, like, structurally the change of that molecule, or the one less molecule that they do to manipulate it in order to make it legal. I don't know what that does to a person, but the research and the experiences show that if an individual has a predisposition to a mental illness, or some type of dormant mental illness that isn't quite active, and they use the Delta 8, it's been shown that it could ignite that mental illness. And I've seen guys come in to facilities in full-blown psychosis, talking with themselves, hearing voices, and it's quite a scary, it's quite a scary sight. So it's definitely a concern if we're talking about youth prevention, for sure. Um, so the illicit drug use, other than marijuana, 4.6% of 8th graders, 5% of 10th graders, 7% of 12th graders, any illicit drug use other than marijuana in the past year. And use of narcotics other than heroin, including Vicodin, Oxycontin, Percocet, etc., 12th graders with 1%. So a little bit of hope. There is 62% of the 12th graders which report abstaining from the use of marijuana, alcohol, and nicotine over the past month. And I will say that it is my understanding, while, like, we're looking at these statistics, obviously that's scary, but I will say that the kids nowadays seem to be much more into, like, fitness and going to the gym. You don't see them smoking cigarettes. They're very much more accepting of one another and empowering each other. At least that's the perception that I see. So there is still quite a concern with the percentage of the substance use that we're looking at over this time. And the amount of fentanyl poisoning and that we're seeing in the community. I mean, it's still a scary thing. I'm not trying to minimize that. But I feel good about the kids, and how they're reacting with each other and being peers and supporting one another. So that's pretty good. Good to see, at least, I think. So one other thing I wanted to touch on. I got about 2 more minutes. Okay. So one other thing I wanted to touch on was the overdose deaths in the United States. So in 2010, obviously, as you're going to 2020, the overdose deaths increased. Throughout the last 4 or so years, you've seen the amount of substance use stay stagnant. So um, when you're talking about this prevention of overdose, Narcan is the best tool to do that. And it is proven to be safe, but we still are dealing with a lot of stigma. And you'll see what I'm hearing is, certain parents are apprehensive or, cautious to introduce that into their home or as a conversation starter with their child, as if it's going to enable them to use substances. So as if having this naloxone in the home or talking about is going to make the child go out and seek substances, which is completely false. And to back that up, the statistics from the NIDA, it shows that over time, the amount of substance use has stayed pretty much the exact same, if not reduced, but the amount of overdoses has substantially increased. So what that means is the fentanyl obviously has been being introduced to the kids, but the amount of naloxone that's being, you know, um, that's being out is not making the statistic of kids, substance use going higher, right? So we're seeing more naloxone out into the community, but the substance use is staying the same, So I think that's one stat that kind of shows that stigma myth is not quite true. And I think that naloxone can be used as a tool to open that honest communication. I know I got a 9-year-old boy, and I've taken him to do some of the outreach in the community. And he kind of surprised me one time when we were talking about it, walking out to the car, and he said the training like word for word on how to use the naloxone. And a lot of times, I don't think he's paying attention or listening to a damn thing I'm saying, but he said it, word for word, and really surprised me. And my hopes in that is that he feels comfortable to be able to talk with me if he is ever struggling or he's at school and one of his friends happens to be introducing something to him or struggling himself, or maybe his parents are struggling, and he's noticing that his friend is having some issues because their parent is using, or I would hope that that line of communication and us talking about that in my home would allow him to be comfortable enough for us to be able to talk rather than maybe how a lot of us have been raised. I know my home communication was not that was not big, in my house. So I think that's all the time I got. I appreciate you guys letting me share.
Thank you so much, Rhino. I think that it's really important for us as parents and caregivers to have that understanding of what's actually going on, what substances are present, what substances are our children and our youth aware of, and to just build our knowledge and power around that. And I really loved, Rhino, where you said that they listen, right? Our kids listen, even if it doesn't seem like they might listen. And I want to share some information just very quickly with you about you as an influencer, parents as an influencer. I believe that some of us feel like, nah, their peers are the top group. They're listening to social media. They're listening to all the other things. And there's truth in that. But there's also data to support the fact that youth do still look at their parents and their caregivers as a source of truth. For example, 45% of youth say that their parents and caregivers are trusted and sort of informants on accurate information. And that's the number 2 spot. Healthcare providers fall at the number 1 spot. So second down, parents are that go-to spot. 60% of our youth say that family is most important to them. And oddly enough, following not far behind at 29%, youth say that their peers are the most important thing to them. So that's a great rate that our young people are still looking to their families for comfort and for insight. Parents hold the number one spot for youth feeling the most comfortable talking with them about substances. So that's another little piece of information. Now, as always with data, I like to give the little caveat. As they get older, though, that influence does diminish and they do start to look more closely to their peers and more closely to their significant others. But again, those parent and that caregiver spot is still up there. One thing I really like is things that we do as parents anyway, like know where our kids are, or ask them what their friends are like, or try to figure out how they interact with the world. And that's called parental monitoring. And there's some statistics basically that are framing parental monitoring and quality relationship with your young person, basically cutting substance use or the likelihood of substance use by a third. And I think that's incredibly powerful and something that we can all remember. But of course, as always, kids will admit, our youth will admit that the internet is that number one place to get information. So while they may look to their families and the adults, the important adults in their life, they're still getting some other information. So Laura, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to you.
All right. Well, good evening. Thank you all for being here. I know it's the evening. It's right at, at least in my house, right around dinner time. So I appreciate that the folks that did prioritize and were able to do that and to be here, even if you're joining us in the recording after the fact that you made time to revisit this, I think like you're already winning as a parent and as a caregiver, that you're seeking the information. And that's one of the things that we are going to talk about in terms of like how to prepare ourselves to continually be the parent that talks about these things and that can be talked to about these things as well. And I really love what was said about there's so much hope in this generation. I know it's so easy for us, 1, 2 generations removed, to be looking at some of these young people like, I don't even understand what they're saying, right? Let alone what they're thinking. But there's so much hope in this generation. I agree with you. There's the way that they treat each other and their awareness of self and awareness of humanity, I think is something really different that we're seeing that is positive. And sometimes frustrating for some of us parents who are being called out on maybe not having that same type of way that we relate to people. So I just wanted to sort of lead with that. But my name is Laura Holly, and I am the Training and Education Director for the Community Coalition Alliance. I have been working in prevention for a number of years, but either prevention or prevention adjacent, as I like to say it, for 20 years, starting in youth services, specifically with adolescents and teenagers. I do have a master's in counseling and a background in brain development and adolescent development as well. And I am the parent of a very spirited 15-year-old girl. So I bring that to the table as well. That's sort of my living lab at home. So real quick, I do want to, here's the agenda. Let's start with that. This is sort of what we're going to cover over the next, I think we have about 30-ish minutes. I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I work for because they like when I do that. And then we're going to talk about understanding the teenage brain, seeing the world through their eyes. We'll unpack very specifically exactly how to start and have these conversations, including some effective communication techniques. Then we'll talk about setting boundaries, right? It can't all be validating and it can't all just be, listening. And sometimes we've got a parent here, right? So, and then we'll talk about how we can be what I call an askable parent, somebody who is in that percentage of adults and caregivers who their children might be getting the information on the internet, but they're processing it with you. They're coming and verifying it with you, right? And then sort of how to arm yourself with the toolbox you need to be able to respond to the things you might hear when you start asking questions. Then we'll open it up to your questions, and that's kind of what it's going to look like for the next 30 minutes or so. Community Coalition Alliance, if you are not familiar, is a coalition of coalitions where we work with folks like One Voice for for Volusia, and we create this collective voice working towards the same mission of the health and wellness of all Floridians. We leverage ideas, efforts, resources, partnerships, funding streams, all kinds of stuff. We just sort of are collaborating with individually in communities, collectively. That's sort of what we do. I run the training and education department, so I work in workforce development as well as community trainings, and really just anytime I can get in front of people and talk. That's sort of my jam. So that's me and who I work for. This is what we're going to walk away with today. We know that we need to have these open and honest conversations, but sometimes it is counterintuitive to our parenting style or what we desire to do as a parent, especially when fear enters the picture. So I want us to walk away today accepting, really embracing that need for those open and honest conversations, and then understanding sort of what we're up against with the brain development piece, because that factors in, I think, more than we give it credit for typically. Particularly when we see our kids as these intelligent, insightful beings, and yesterday they were super smart and now they're, I like to joke with my daughter, don't be the dumb smart kid. In those moments, that's what it shows up and looks like, right? And so we're going to talk about why that happens, and why they say this incredible thing 1 minute and then do something where you look at them and say, what was happening in your brain in that moment? We're going to talk about it. And then we're going to learn how to become that askable parent. So those are the 3 things we're going to walk away with today. We do have to spend a little bit of time talking about the brain, and then I promise we'll move on from it. But we do, because this is going to be what helps you craft your conversations and what helps you understand sort of the dance that has to go into these conversations so that you get the best results. If you've dealt with teenagers and young people before, you know that you get to a certain point in a conversation and you might think it's going well, and then all of a sudden defensiveness enters the picture, and you're not really sure where that came from. So their brains, and some of this we already know, like teenage brains develop at different rates. So there's no real such thing as like an average 15-year-old. Their brains are no more so than the average height, right? So their brains develop just like their bodies, all different rates. And just like their bodies, the different portions of their brains develop at different rates as well. So one of the things that's sort of commonly known, you may or may not have, but you may have heard before, that their prefrontal cortex doesn't fully develop until they are about 24-ish. And gender plays a factor, but it's right around 24. And that's that frontal lobe that's responsible for a lot of different things. It regulates emotions. It is responsible for good decision making. It's responsible for understanding, thinking ahead, and predicting the consequences of actions. So all of this should be starting to make a little sense to you now, why teenagers don't quite have the same prefrontal cortex that we have, right? And that's talked about a whole lot. But what I find is often missing from the conversation is that there are other parts of the brain that are also developing. And one of the parts of the brain that's fully developed in our teenagers is the amygdala. And the amygdala is the emotional center. So that's the piece that causes fight or flight, right? That's aggression, reflex-like responses. It is what, it's designed to keep us out of danger, right? So we can quickly react. But when we have this fully developed amygdala and this underdeveloped prefrontal cortex, which is supposed to regulate that, that's where we see this spontaneity and this impulsive-ness and these big feelings. I always joke that I feel like we're back in the toddler years when we hit the teen years, like we have big feelings again, right? We have all of that intensity of toddlerhood. It's just that you could control them better when they were 3. So now they have their own ideas about things. So it's a little different. So what does it look like in real life when the amygdala is driving, right? It finds its voice sooner than our prefrontal cortex. And our amygdala is activated in moments of like stress, pressure, defensiveness, danger. So it's very easy for us as parents in these conversations to accidentally activate that. And then all the reasoning shuts down and all of a sudden they're not listening anymore. It's the same reason that, when you sit your kids down and you have these great conversations, maybe at dinner, in the car, and you ask them, what they think about, if they think it's a good idea to get in the car with somebody who's been drinking, they know absolutely not. That's a terrible idea. They're calm, their amygdala is not activated. They're sitting at the dining room table. They're giving you the right answer. They know it, they believe it. Their prefrontal cortex is speaking, they can hear it. And then in the moment where their friends are saying, get in the car, let's go. And maybe there's drama happening at the place that they're leaving, and maybe that pull to fit in and be socially accepted, all of a sudden, all they hear is the amygdala. That's the part of the brain that says, get in the car, it'll be fine. This is why when we talk to our kids and we say, what were you thinking? The real answer is they weren't, because the prefrontal cortex is still there, but it's a whisper and the amygdala is screaming. And so when they're in those situations, they're going to listen to the loudest voice inside their head. And so that's what we're up against when we're talking about decision making and even listening skills in the teenage brain. Here's the good news. It's not all doom and gloom. It's definitely a barrier. But the teen brain is also very ready to learn and adapt, and take in new information and grow and evolve. And even though you can't like force brain development, think of it like any other part of the body. If your teenager wanted to build strength, they would go into the gym and they would lift weights. And they're only going to be able to do so much because their body's still growing, but they can build strength, right? So all the studies have supported that you can also stimulate brain development with creative activities, with exercise, with arts, music, anything that's really using that muscle, that brain, can also really help strengthen the brain circuits, help the brain mature. Anything that's going to challenge them, new experiences, trying something new, even if they're going to fail at it, right? All of that stuff can really help stimulate brain development. So that's one way to approach that. The other things that I want you to know is that the teenage brain responds very differently to stress. So the chances of developing stress-related mental illnesses are higher, and that's something that we want to pay attention to. So recognizing possible triggers, practicing effective coping strategies, that all helps deal with stress better, which helps their brain develop more properly, which helps with the decision making, right? This is all tied into the conversations that we have with them. Anytime we can keep that brain healthy. And then the final thing I want to point out is that most teens don't get enough sleep. We count the hours and we think that they do, but melatonin shows up differently in a teenage brain, and it's lower in the evening and it spikes in the morning, which is why they tend to want to stay up later and sleep in. But the world isn't set up that way for them. They got to get up and go to school. They got to go to bed at a certain time, right? You got to get enough sleep in these societally structured hours. And that does not always happen. And so all of the things that come with sleep deprivation, you're looking at your teenager saying they got 7 hours, they got 8 hours, maybe they got 9 hours, they're good to go. And they're still in some way suffering from sleep deprivation. Most teenagers are not getting enough sleep for the brain that they need and the way that what their brain needs and the way their brain functions. So understand that puts us at a disadvantage when we're having some of these conversations as well, okay? So that's kind of what we're up against. And then socially, we're up against some other things that we have to consider when we're having these conversations. The whole idea of peer pressure is something that I want to talk about, because peer pressure exists even when peers aren't actually applying pressure. Let that one sink in, right? This is self-imposed very often. Teens have a strong desire to fit in with their peer group. They're very focused on avoiding rejection, gaining social acceptance. And then there's some identity confusion and anxiety around that, not really knowing who I am or where I fit in, or, what I'm going to be. And, and it shows up in all kinds of ways with teenagers. And then it's exacerbated by these hormonal inconsistencies that are coming with brain and body development, that really haven't evened out yet. So all of that can happen with accepting friends and encouraging friends, and not peer pressure in the traditional sense, the way that we were taught, right? Peer pressure exists even when they're not applying actual pressure to each other. And so that's sort of an aha. It should be like an aha that's happening even if your kids have good social groups, I guess is my point, right? We think, oh, like my kid's not this victim to peer pressure. It's fine. They have these great group of friends. Yeah, they are. They're doing it to themselves. And then, the idea that it's their entire job, correctly, like they should be doing this, to find themselves, to separate from you, to get their own identity, to seek independence. That's their whole job. And I heard it explained one time. I thought it was a great way to say it, that they're preparing to leave the nest. So in these teenage years, in these high school years, they are preparing to leave the nest. But in order to do that, the nest can't be warm and comfy. They have to mess it up, right? They have to make it prickly and someplace they don't want to be in order to really be able to separate. And so that's where some of that friction comes from. And that's where some of that perception that they aren't listening to anything you're saying, they don't agree with anything you're doing, they're not gonna, that's where we feel like we don't have influence, even though we know that we do. We look at the data and we know that at the end of the day, when it's really important, they might roll their eyes and tell you to buzz off, but they're listening and they're considering, and that what you say and what you model really does matter. But it's their whole job. So, hesitating to get frustrated and angry at them doing their job and doing it well, right? It's tough, man. It's tough. Raising teens is not for the faint of heart. So those are the things that are operating against us. And that's what we have to keep in mind when we go into these conversations. So what do the conversations need to look like? Choose a time and a place that makes sense. This is personal to you and your family and your kid, but have that be intentional. I'm a fan of the car. We have like a 30-minute ride to school, and I know that she's going to start driving real soon, and that's going to go away. But the car is that captive audience. She can't go anywhere. She doesn't have to like it, but I can talk, right? Sometimes it's the dinner table, whether that's eating out somewhere or in your own home, it doesn't really matter. Again, that's that creating that expectation of a captive audience. Like, you're here for 30 minutes, and I'm going to use this time to talk to you. So whatever that means for your family and for you and what makes sense for your kid, be very intentional with that time and that place. Have a plan, right? Don't go into this conversation blind. Know that, you know the points you want to make, sort of what you want your kid to walk away with. If you're seeking information in this conversation, you know what that is. You've sort of picked your battles going in. But also, oh my goodness, be flexible, because you're going to have to pivot. If you do this right, and it results in your child talking, that's the point. And you're going to need to be flexible. So have your plan and make sure that you're not rigid in that plan. And then it's incredibly helpful if we disclose what prompted this conversation. Did you hear a rumor? Did another parent say something to you? Did you read an article that kind of scared you? Did you attend a workshop or a webinar where you learned some things and went, you know what, I need to be having this conversation, or I want to ask you about this? That helps put it in context for them. It prevents, it's one of the things we can do that prevents us from activating that amygdala that we talked about. So they're not going to be so fight or flight with you. They're not going to spend all their time in the conversation wondering why now, why are you asking this, what's going on. Just disclose it, right? Even if it's you heard something about a friend, one of their friends, or you saw something on social media, like whatever it is. Okay. Now, as the conversation unfolds, listen more than you're talking. That you lay it out and then really listen more than you're talking. If you find yourself going on and on, stop it. Accept their language. It's your responsibility in conversations like this to what I call listen in their language, right? So that's accepting slang terms. Consider accepting words you normally would not allow them to say. And that's a personal decision. But I know that when I'm talking to my daughter, if she slips and says a word that is not okay to say in our house, if it's a really important conversation we're having about life or death, I might I might give her one of those, but I'm going to accept that in this conversation. I'm not going to allow the words to become more important than the messaging. And then pick your battles. That kind of falls under that category, right? Pick your battles. If I get an eye roll in that conversation, I might have to kind of bite a hole through my tongue and let that go, because in this particular conversation, there's higher stakes. There's some more important things that I'm going to want to make sure we walk away with. Then you rolled your eyes at me, and that became the focus of the conversation. So a lot of times, again, those are small signs that amygdala is activating: the eye rolls, the interrupting, the the sort of pushing back. And so if we sort of respond the same way we always do, then we kind of get into that back and forth parent-child fight. Now it feels more familiar to them, in some ways more comfortable. They've created that environment. They know how to navigate that, even if they do it poorly, right? They know what to expect. And now the conversation's about that. So we want to make sure the conversation stays where we want it to be. And we might have to pick our battles. We might have to accept some slang language and some things like that in order to do so. Remain judgment-free and empathy-driven. When we're talking about these topics, even abstractly, if we're talking about people at all, and this touches on what we said earlier, right, about this generation, they are very in tune to empathy and judgment and acceptance, inclusivity, all of that. So if you start to speak with a voice that is very obviously counter to that, even if it's just from a generational standpoint, there's going to be some friction. We run the risk of activating that amygdala, right? So we want to make sure that we're really leading with a lot. Plus, also the uncomfortable truth is you don't know what they might share with you. So if you're judging with your words, it might reduce what they are willing to share with you that they might actually really need to share. So here's some strategies. We're going to unpack these. So the first one is to ask these open-ended questions. We're going to avoid yes and no questions as a way to stimulate the conversation. Some of this, I mean, you're going to have yes and no questions you're going to ask, but just if you're finding that the conversation is not progressing, and you might look at, is that all I'm asking, right? And we want to sort of diversify our questions, I guess is a better way to put that, right? And then be comfortable with not every question being answered, particularly theoretical ones or ethical questions, or decision-based questions, right? Not those sort of concrete fact-based questions, but things that you may want them to think about. It's okay if you're just like, okay, well, I'd like you to consider that, give that some thought, or just be able to go, I wonder, and just leave things there. Everything doesn't have to be wrapped up in a nice, neat little bow, because hopefully, ideally, you're going to be revisiting this topic with your teenager. This isn't going to be an isolated conversation. And so it's okay to leave that door open on some of those questions. We also want to have reflective listening. Again, with that generational voice that they have, this is a very important thing. And to some older generations, this feels a little like woo-woo and touchy-feely and fluffy, but it's so important. It's really important with what we know about human beings, and this generation has just sort of nailed that. So we've got to play in that sandbox a little bit if we want them to hear us. And so we can validate those feelings that they are having by naming emotions back to them. Because keep in mind, at this age, they're also struggling to identify and learn what those emotions are. So they're going to use a whole lot of words to say something like, that was confusing. So you can help when they're using all those words and they're talking about what they've seen with their friends and this, and it doesn't match what they read. You can go, well, that sounds confusing. That's sort of what that looks like and sounds like. You can give them the words by telling them what you're hearing them say. But I do have to give my disclaimer. Please don't say, what I'm hearing you say is, because everyone on the planet now knows they're being managed when you say that. So it's really effective. It was really effective. It's just overtaught. So now when people say that, you sort of know you're being managed, right? But you can just say, that sounds like this. That seems like it would be difficult. How do you navigate that? Or do you navigate that? Or is that just staying in that confusion place, right? We can name those things back. So we don't have to fix every emotional problem that we have. Validating is not the same thing as fixing. It's just saying, I hear you and I hear what you're saying and I understand the emotion you're conveying. And that helps a whole lot. This one's harder than it sounds, focusing on facts and avoiding those scare tactics. And here's why it's harder, because when you start talking about fentanyl, which I want you to do, it all sounds like a scare tactic because it is that scary. And very often teenagers do not realize the scope of that issue and how terrifying it really is. So it sounds really scary and it sounds almost untrue. If you're starting to see, you know your kid better than anybody. If you're starting to see those signs in that face that they're not buying it, acknowledge that. Like, this sounds like a scare tactic. This is that horrifying. But it's not. These are the facts. That's where being armed, again, going back to having a plan, being armed with a little bit of data. It doesn't have to be a whole lot, but the whole like 1 in 7 pills, right? We talked about that earlier, right? Just knowing that this is showing up in every street drug, letting them know that it's also showing up in fake pills. And most people your age who are taking fake pills don't even know they're fake. They think they're real. They think because they trust their friend who really is just trusting another friend who you don't even know, right? Like, give them those scenario based facts that we know are happening every day. And keep our language really simple, keep our again, this helps us avoid activating that part of the brain. Keep our tone really consistent. We don't have to amp up when we're talking about the scarier stuff. Actually, if we keep it pared down, it's going to hit a little bit better and they're going to listen to that a little bit more, right? Focus on the reality of the situation that's out there, right? We also have to acknowledge the messages that teens receive, right? They see people who use, and those people seem fine. That is a real thing that's happening in their world. And again, we talked earlier about brain development. We know that with the lack of the prefrontal cortex being fully developed, that they're not going to be able to put those pieces together the same way that we can. So we've got to lay that out for them. The fact that we don't know this person that you're looking at that seems fine, that we know is using. It's a game of Russian roulette, right? That at any given moment, like, we also know people who don't wear seatbelts when they get in the car, and they're alive too. But those are the people who die when something goes wrong. We know people who don't wear helmets when they ride motorcycles, and they are currently alive. But those are the people that die when they get in a motorcycle accident. So really pointing out those things, using comparables, letting them know that we don't know what that looks like for that person who's using in 5 years, 1 year, 10 years, the long-term effects. And letting them know that what they see in front of them in the here and now isn't the full picture. And also asking them some open-ended questions and bringing into, like, teenagers bragging and teenagers being accurate with the things that they're saying. So what they are perceiving is happening with some people they know might not even be what's really happening, and having them, entertain that idea. Here's a really, really hard one, the last one in the strategies, but it's arguably one of the most important. And that is, if, as an example, if you want to know if their friend Johnny is vaping, you better not forbid them to hang out with Johnny because they told you Johnny was vaping, right? Now, disclaimer, total caveat, imminent danger. Johnny vaping is a little different than Johnny cooking meth in his basement. I get it. Okay. There are going to be things that are going to lead to the you cannot hang out with that person anymore conversation. But in the general, like, yeah, I heard so-and-so vapes. If we overreact to those things, we will hear less of them. If you want to know what's going on in their world, they have to make sure. We went through that whole list before of the things that are important to them, that self-imposed peer pressure, fitting in, social acceptance, not being rejected. If that stuff becomes something they think is at risk, their amygdala is going to be fully activated. That conversation is shutting down and nothing you say is getting in anymore. So we've got to make sure that we are having more conversation if things are disclosed, right? More conversation, like, about what they've witnessed, how they've responded to it, how it makes them feel. What do they think of those choices Johnny's making? How have they been involved? What are some of the legal consequences they might face should they allow that behavior sort of in their stratosphere, right? So we can talk about all those things, which leads us to possibly having to set some boundaries, which is very important and also not harmful at all in these conversations. We got to parent. We have to do that. That's part of why we're a big influence on their life. They know they can count on us for structure as well. Okay, so respond to any concerns they may have shared. You can absolutely talk about what you are fearful of for them, what you are worried about for them. Explain to them that the don't do drugs messaging has changed, and we touched on that earlier, right? That when we were growing up, it was don't do drugs because it could mess up your life, and now the messaging is don't do drugs, you could die the first time you do it. And really talk to them about how fentanyl has changed the landscape and therefore has changed your concerns and fears as a parent, and that some of your rules and your structure and your expectations are going to be driven by that, because your whole job is to make sure that they, stay alive and grow and thrive and become productive adults. And really, pointing those things out to them. We want to set really clear expectations and consequences that lead with safety, right? Develop your reputation for being a parent that draws a hard line with health and safety and not a hard line with all the other stuff that's just noise. I understand that your friend Johnny vapes. I don't like that. It's my expectation that if he is choosing that you're gonna remove yourself from that situation. How do you plan on doing that? And then when he wants to go to the movies with Johnny, let him go to the movies with Johnny. If you have expectations about how he's going to behave, and again, in those non-imminent danger situations, and you're going to trust your child to navigate that because you've set those boundaries, those clear expectations, you can have conversations after too. Hey, how'd that go? How was that received? Maybe it didn't go well socially. Maybe it did. Maybe it was, again, this generation being like, I respect that. That's cool. I'll see you later. Right. They may be surprised by the reaction that they get. And then also just consequences to their actions that aren't necessarily intentionally punitive, right? But if they make certain choices, you're not going to be able to do X, Y, and Z hobby anymore. You won't be able to. You'll have eroded our trust, and therefore, your life's going to look a little different with what you're going to be allowed to do and not allowed to do. And it's not a punishment; it's a safety measure because you've eroded our trust, or you're struggling with substances, or here are the consequences that will happen in your life, not here are the punishments I will give you. It's a little bit of a different take on that conversation that we'll get through a little bit easier. Okay. Being an askable parent, and I know I only have a few minutes left. I think we're down to like 10 minutes, but I'm going to cover it all, I promise. We want to be available. We want to earn permission to discuss the hard things. What do I mean by that? Discuss all the things. If you want to be able to have social, emotional permission to push a little bit in these conversations, you're going to have to talk about all the things, even the stuff you don't care about. I know that that's controversial to say. There's things your kids talk to you about that you don't care about, but I don't care about the whole social stratosphere of the high school. And yet my child comes home and tells me all the things and all the tea. And I am very interested because I want permission to discuss her life and what's happening in her social world. And if I'm going to talk to her about substances and who's doing what and what choices she's making, I'm also going to talk to her about who is crushing on the new boy, right? Because that's all part of the social stratosphere. So be available, talk to them about all the things that are happening in their lives, because this shows up in places you would least expect. And when you have permission to enter those spaces, it's so much easier to have these conversations. Also be a role model. What you do matters more than what you say, but what you say can also supplement that. And what do I mean by that? Let's say you are engaging in perfectly safe, legal adult activities like ordering a glass of wine at dinner, right? Discuss that. Discuss your reasons out loud for not ordering the second class when the server comes over. Oh, no, thanks. I have an early morning, right? If you make a mistake, admit that and discuss that. I shouldn't have had a second glass. I'm not driving. Dad is, so that part was okay. But you really didn't need that. My body didn't really need that, right? Whatever. And again, I'm not judging. I'm just saying, like, whatever that is for you, discuss your mistakes, whether they're with substances or anything else, verbally out loud in the presence of your kids. Discussing your choices and processing them out loud in the presence of your kids can be really, really helpful. And then the other is lack of judgment elsewhere. This is kind of a hard one, guys, but lack of judgment in other spaces. If you're judging everything harshly in front of them, and then you can't really expect them to believe that you will not judge their friends or their struggles with what to choose and how to go down this road, right? Don't try to convince them that this is the exception to your judgment, right? Make you being non-judgmental a rule. And again, this is in stuff that's not hurting anyone. So, one of the really big controversial things right now, and everybody's sort of all over the board with how they feel about it and respond to it, and I totally get that. But let's say, as an example, your teenager comes home and says that there's, a kid in their class that is going by a different name or different pronouns now. If that's not infecting your kid at all, or that's not hurting your kid in that moment, right? You can just not judge that, and that would go a long way. If your kid's not judging it, just, oh, wow, okay, that's interesting, right? And maybe don't choose that battle to have, because that'll set you up as an askable parent for other things that might be controversial and difficult to talk about. So picking our battles with where we're going to outwardly verbalize some of our thoughts and feelings on things can help. And then in terms of substances, bringing it up often, normalizing it, acknowledging the nuances, right? Share stories. If you work in this space, some of us on this call do, like, talk about things from work. Of course, respecting people's privacies, no names and identifiers, but you can talk about stuff. You can talk about data that you learned. You can say, oh, did you see that news article? You can talk about something you saw with an old classmate on Facebook, right? That was, you could talk about that. Just make this a normalized conversation so that it's much easier for you to broach when you do have something like really important that you want to sit them down and talk about. Now, sometimes we want to have this conversation reactively and not proactively. So it's going to be important that we are somewhat familiar with the signs. If this might be a trigger for us to have a conversation. So I've got the physical, psychological, behavioral signs up there. The physical is the eyes and the stomach issues and the skin bruising and rapid speech, that sort of thing. Psychological is that mood swings, anxiety, irritability, paranoia. And then behavioral is a lot about like hygiene and secrecy. There's a lot of stuff around there, and sudden changes in like friend groups and school attendance and stuff like that, and activities. And disclose if this is the reason, right? Hey, I'm concerned about you, and it's because I've noticed that you're not hanging out with that friend group anymore, right? So disclose it. Don't make them guess, because there might be a reason. Well, yeah, she did this to me, and so now it's been a whole thing and I'm struggling with it, but it might not have to do with substances. Understand too that some of this, mood swings, change of an interest in activities, demanding privacy, having a stomach ache, that's like normal, like teenage experiences, right? So understand that these are not standalone. We're looking for clusters of things and sudden changes that fall on this list. And then you're going to want to pay attention. We also want to look for, pay attention to items that are associated with drug messaging, clothes, tattoos, room decor, things like that are consistent, music, celebrities' websites that are consistent with drug messaging. Also, items that might be used to cover up drug use, like sunglasses at night and eye drops and fabric spray and room spray and mouthwash and incense. And then also paraphernalia. We know if we're finding something like needles or, that's drug paraphernalia, but there's also like tinfoil and recycling, crushed cans, screens, small mirrors, plastic baggies, razor blades, rolling paper, cigars, straws, plastic straws that are cut. There's things like that that we want to make sure we are paying attention to. If we're starting to see a couple of those items, and then we're starting to see some of the psychological signs, right now we get a bigger picture when we're also looking at the things that travel along with substance use, and just sort of paying attention to that bigger picture of what we might be looking at. And then being a prepared parent, right? If we want to be prepared to deal with anything they might bring to us or anything they might say in conversations that we might have, you got to learn those trends and the behavior. You got to learn the trends. Be on social media, be where they are on social media, and look at the things they're looking at so the algorithm shows you the same stuff, right? That's really important. Don't be like that parent that doesn't know how to use Snapchat. I was that for a long time, but you gotta get over it, right? And you have to be on there, even if it's just to know what they know, right? Participate in, show up to stuff like this, show up to workshops, participate in stuff like Hidden in Plain Sight, participate in the things that are available to you so you stay on top of the changing landscape, learn the resources, get with your coalition, learn where you can go for help, where you can go for information with answers, subscribe to stuff, and then identify your partners. And I don't just mean organizations, like it takes a village, other parents, that person at the school that really cares for your kid, the people at church, the other a neighbor, other people, right? Who's your village and who are your partners in this, that can also be there to help keep your kid on the right path. So that I blew through, so we have 2 minutes left for questions. I made sure I could get through that, but there's just so much to share, and I could go on and on and on, but I want to make sure if anybody's got any questions, we can address those.
I just want to thank our presenters and our speakers today. Thank you for being here and providing this excellent information. For posterity's sake, our recorded attendees, we appreciate you, and we will share information with you just so that you always have those resources, and we're able to do that.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to share and talk and meet new people.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rhino, for everything. All right. Thank you so much for attending, everybody. Let's continue this conversation, continue our charge for caring for our youth of our community, and across not just Volusia County, but all of our counties. So thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful evening.